Absolutely fantastic.
My kid's sister was born in Germany, at Baumholder, and there was a comedian, Irma Bombeck, and she was doing this little conversation between a mother and a daughter, and the daughter said, "Oh, Mom, we're going to Europe," and the mom with this accent goes, "Europe, big deal, I was born there." I was thinking my sister. So, but Germany, what a deal. After 18 years, they let me come home. So, we have moved up in life to the 7th chapter of the book, which I just screwed up. And it is on solitude. So what were your impressions?
I read it in solitude.
And
I liked, it made me reflect a lot more on the control of my tongue.
oh, how so?
Give more thought. Reflect a little bit more sometimes before speaking. Not be so. I wouldn't say the word reactionary is what I'm looking for, because everybody's like that, but just give more reflection before.
So, silence, solitude, talking.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What was your biggest impression?
Well, I've never had anybody actually come up and tell me, but reading through this is, I can go back over many instances just at work in my last few years where I talked way too much. But I learned that when I was younger, because we had people that I went to school with that sat there and hardly ever talked. And I was always amazed at that they had that quiet. Now, whether that was shyness or it was just something they were brought up at home, I always enjoyed the people that you could carry a conversation home with, rather than the ones that just kind of sat there and you think, are you, and maybe they weren't. Maybe they were actually doing solitude at that moment. But that was my biggest thing. And I realized there were a lot of times when, especially the times when I would interject at the wrong time. You could just kill the moment, you know, and sometimes it's hard to sit there and just let it go. Just be quiet. They'll get to the end of this and whatever. But the one area I didn't know, the dark night of the soul, was the area that I had probably the most trouble.
Okay. Dark night. St. John of the Cross. How about you, Clarence? What are your thoughts?
I thought it was good. The should I say, distinction between doing things because you don't want to be lonely and solitude, I thought was good. Although I need help with the part about Peter and offering to build the 3 shelters for Jesus and who was it, Moses and
Elijah.
To me, he may have been, I mean, who would have known what they were looking at that time? Did he? And to me, he was trying to make an earnest effort to do well, and he's calling it a sacrifice of fools. So I'm taking what I think is an earnest gesture on Peter's part, and this gentleman's describing it as a sacrifice of fools, so I need a little help.
Yeah. Whenever I read this chapter, I always think of, there's a group of Benedictine monks that you all have heard of, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, kind of a famous name. He wrote the hymn that we sing, also, "O Sacred Head Now Wounded." He lived, around 1100 roughly, and in Benedictine monasticism, the individual monk owns nothing, but the house can own, like whatever. So, some pious person donates a farm to the monastery so they have a place to grow food. Well, the monastery doesn't die, and the farm is still there, and the more they accumulate over time, the richer they become. And so it's like going home to your parents' house. You've got your own room, and you don't own the house. You don't pay the utilities. Mom feeds you. You could be literally penniless, and you're living in air-conditioned splendor with cable and internet and that kind of thing. So there's always this move in monasticism to be more hardcore, and periodically there's new orders, and one of them, the Cistercians, they don't talk, because there's a place in the scriptures where it says you'll be judged by every word that you say. So one of the things is, Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again, and there will be a judgment when he comes. You're going to have this conversation with him. So the Cistercians are like, the less you say, the less painful that encounter's going to be. So there's a joke that I always think of with this, where a guy joins the Cistercians, and once every 5 years he gets to sit down with the abbot. And so after 5 years he says, "Food, bad." And the abbot nods his head. 5 years later he goes, "Bed, hard." And the abbot shakes his head. 15-year point, he says, "I quit." And the abbot goes, "Well, son, I'm not surprised. The only thing you've done since you got here was complain." So I always think of that with this business of solitude. I think what he wants to get at is, in order for a person to cultivate their relationship with the Lord, there is, on a regular basis, an appropriate disconnecting from everything going on around you and getting some time to let things die down so that you can hear the Lord and be with the Lord without any distractions. And modern life is so bloody busy. The cell phones and the internet, and it's like I'm sitting here traveling light. I didn't bring my computer with me, but I have a cell phone that's really a computer. I have this Kindle that is a computerized book. I've got an iPad. We're broadcasting to the world. There's noise, or the potential of noise, everywhere we turn. And we are in community. We live in towns and cities and so forth. And when was the last time that you were doing something and you suddenly realized that you hadn't heard a car, a truck, a train, an airplane flying overhead, and it was just nature? When we first got the farm, one day I was down there by myself doing some stuff, and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it suddenly dawned on me that I hadn't heard a voice, a man-made noise, and the only thing that I could hear was the wind in the trees and birds and so forth. And our life is so loud all the time, and didn't used to be that way. The Catholics have kept up a tradition of retreat, where you intentionally disconnect and go to a place that everything about it is set up for you to have that quiet time. And the point of it is to be able to stop being distracted in order to focus. It's a lot like fasting. You know, fasting's not just, I'm not going to eat because it just seems like a good thing to do today, you know. The purpose of a fast is to disconnect from the whole business of food preparation in order to focus on prayer. So there's a purpose to it. So there's a purpose to this solitude. So that's my first thought is, why bother with this? And the answer is so that you can hear the still small voice. Remember the story of Elijah? He, does this duel with 450 prophets of Baal, and the God that answers with fire. It's very dramatic, and they kill all the false prophets. And then all of a sudden he gets afraid of the queen and literally runs from up in the north of Israel into the Negev to Mount Sinai. It's a pretty good run. I mean, the guy's got to be a great marathoner to go cover that kind of distance. And he's hiding in a cave on Mount Horeb. And there's this wonderful story as it goes on with God tells him that he's going to pass by. And there's this amazing strong wind and fire and earthquake and all these huge events, and it says God was not in the wind, God was not in the earthquake, God was not in the fire. And then there's the whisper, and I love the phrase, I don't know what it means, still small voice. And that's God speaking to Elijah, and he needed to get disconnected from everything and calm down and get it out of his ears and out of his mind, and then he could hear God. Solitude. Does that make any sense? Part of a rhythm.
It does.
Jesus is one who practices solitude. In the chapter, I remember, I don't have the page numbers here, but
I think 97.
he lists some things. There's a paragraph that starts, inward solitude has outward manifestations. There is the freedom to be alone, not in order to be away from people, but in order to hear the divine whisper better. Jesus lived in inward heart solitude. He also frequently experienced outward solitude. So it lists a series of events here. He inaugurated his ministry by spending 40 days alone in the desert. So, you have to kind of put your imagination in. The Gospels don't, like Luke has circumcision, bar mitzvah, and then he's 30. And that's all we know about Jesus' childhood. We skip the first 30 years because, he grew up in a Jewish home. What else do you want to know? But when it was time, and Jesus had this inner clock, that he had this sense of, he said several times, my time has not yet come, or it's not my time. He's aware of everything going on around him, and he has this sense of when he needs to change gears and go to the next level. And so he somehow knows it's time to start the public ministry, and he starts it by going to John the Baptist and getting baptized, and then the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. And it says in the scriptures for 40 days. And one time I was working on the text in Gospel of Luke, and a friend of mine who's a rabbi came up and he grabbed my Bible and whipped it around, and he explained to me that 40 days could be 40 24-hour days, or it could be like a season that has a beginning, maturation, comes to a completion. So, you know, in his eyes, as a Jew that very rarely looked at the New Testament, when he read that, he was thinking, you know, he went out into the desert for this period of temptation, and when it was complete, it was over. And a Jewish way to say that, 40 days, 40 hours, 40 years. So one of the things that when you're reading the scriptures is, what's it say, and what am I trying to superimpose on it? You know, and like, I live in 21st century America, and a day is 23.97 hours or whatever it is. You know, and it's all somehow linked to the rotation of the earth on an orbit around the sun, and, you know, it's got to be this, and that's not necessarily what it means in a 2,000-year-old text. So Jesus goes out and he's by himself, and oh, by the way, he's also fasting, and he's definitely not eating. At the end of it, it says he was hungry. He had to drink. You know, he'd be dead in 3 days and wouldn't be much of a story. So he's out there, and he is clearly contemplating the nature of his ministry. So before he even begins, he's visualizing it, you know, kind of a Stephen Covey thing, begin with the end in mind. You know, Jesus is doing that. He's getting his act together. He's anticipating what's going to come. He's praying and so forth. And all of the temptations have to do with, how are you going to execute this role? And, you know, of course, one of them, like the, you know, pulling stunts, like throwing yourself off the top of the temple and not being killed, you know, instead of being dashed on the stones below, the angels will pick you up, or buying favor by turning stones into bread. And they're all about, how are you going to conduct this ministry? Before he chose the 12, the entire night alone in the desert hills praying. It's in Luke 6. And, we've all been on teams. Who you pick to be on your team really matters. You could pick somebody and they drag the team down. And so Jesus spent the night by himself in prayer, thinking that one through, talking with the Lord, you know, his Father, about how to do that and who to pick. When he received the news of John the Baptist's death, he withdrew and went to, quote, a lonely place. So we don't know the details of his relationship with John. We know that they're related, could be as close as first or second cousins. The fact that Mary went to Elizabeth seems to me would indicate a closeness. You wouldn't go to a total stranger, that's for sure. You wouldn't go to somebody you didn't like. I mean, she was a teenage girl pregnant, and, you know, did she go hide out at her aunt's house? You know, it doesn't say, so we don't know. But how often did the family get together? You know, did Jesus and John grow up together? Did they see each other a couple times a year, once a year, every couple of years? Not at all. We just don't know. but clearly the death of John was a personal loss for him. And it's also part of that internal clock that I mentioned with when an event happened, Jesus interpreted the events about his public ministry. And so when John died, that changed the game. There's a place right outside of Capernaum that to this day is, probably for tourists, but they call it the lonely place. And you can literally walk from the ruins of there's a ruin of a synagogue there, and you can walk just a few hundred feet and go out of the town up on this little hill, and there's a tiny little cave. It's big enough to sit in. Somebody's put a very crude bench, and you can sit on that bench and look out the mouth of the cave, and you got the whole Sea of Galilee spread out in front of you. And they call it the lonely place. And Jesus will routinely be involved in teaching and healing and exercising, and then he'll send his crew ahead and stay behind in a lonely place to pray. Or he'll get up at the crack of dawn the next morning in order to pray. So he's one that routinely is seeking to disconnect from the press of people in order to be in a place where he can pray to his Father uninterrupted with the stimuli down. Obviously the most important one, just kind of jumping ahead, is what was he doing right before he got arrested? He went off to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, and the physical location of that is nobody's really 100% sure, but by the Essene or the Zion Gate, there's an Essene monastery, and they've done some excavation there, and the thinking is, the little story about go get the donkey and the foal of the donkey for me to ride into town on, and the sign to Peter is, you'll see a man carrying water in a society where women carry water. But the Essenes in some of their communities were all male. So who carries the water in an all male community? A guy carrying water that could be just one of those little tidbits of information. There was some kind of a connection there. They also kept a different calendar. So Jesus seems to have celebrated the Passover on a Tuesday night instead of Thursday night, and the Essenes always celebrated on this different calendar, and there are people who put those little pieces together, and they say, it's possible. Can't prove it, but it's possible. But he celebrates the Passover, and then they go several hundred yards away from the walled city, down the Kidron Valley, into this olive grove. The Mount of Olives gets its name because there's olives growing all up and down it, and he's in this garden, walled, and there's actually a small cave that has an olive press in it. It's a possibility that that's where they were hanging out to get out of the dampness of the night, kind of thing, and he's gone off by himself to pray. And question, how does anybody know what he was praying about? But we're told, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. So he's struggling in prayer about what he knows and that he's been setting up for months and years. And he goes to a place of solitude where he won't be interrupted, where he can focus on the prayer. So this is Jesus' style. Kind of convicts me of, so Rick, as a disciple, tell me about your prayer life. Like, yeah, I'm praying here with 3 computers and a cell phone. So solitude, it's like, if for no other reason, Jesus practiced it. If he needed it, might be that I need it. You might need it. Great quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer's career was, he's this brilliant young academic, and when the Nazis were taking over Germany in the early 30s, they were also taking over the church. They took over all the trade unions and the faculties of the universities and the newspapers and so forth, and taking over the church as well. And so there were Lutheran and Reformed Protestants that wanted to keep training clergy, seminary type training, independent of the Nazi-controlled major universities. And so they recruited people like Bonhoeffer. I can't remember the total number of these schools that they had around the country, but Bonhoeffer was in Prussia, which is up in the northeast of Germany, past Berlin, heading out into Poland. And he was, at one point in time, sent to London to get him out of the country, and then they brought him back, and he led this seminary. And he was responsible for the curriculum and the community life, and he was the director. So 2 books emerged from that experience. One of them is called The Cost of Discipleship, which is what he taught them, and it's basically a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount and some other issues. Unbelievably powerful book, and if you haven't read it, get it, read it. One time when I was in Mannheim, I bet the congregation that I give $100 each to anybody that could read the first chapter. And there were a bunch of people in my small group that tried, Norm, and they didn't get through it. It is the single most devastating critique of modern Christianity and modern Lutheranism, and it will change your life if you can get through that first chapter. And the rest of the book is just more of the same. The second book that comes out of that,
What was the first book again?
Cost of Discipleship,
Cost of Discipleship.
and probably in here somewhere. I'm not sure. I think I saw it in here. The other one was called Life Together, and what Dietrich did was organize the community life of about 30 young men in a kind of a monastic lifestyle for, I think he had them for 6 months at a time, and it's lessons learned from living together in Christian community, and really wonderful stuff. There's one place in there where he's talking about marriage, and he's got 30 young men, so it's worth one lesson. And so he wasn't married. He'd been engaged and then broke the engagement off, and then toward the end of his life, right before he got arrested, he got engaged again, and then was arrested and died before they could marry. But his niece was getting married, and he wrote her this letter from Tegel prison right before he died on the occasion. He couldn't go to the wedding, obviously, so he sent this letter. And I went to a conference in Princeton. Teresa and I were there, and Eberhard Bethke, his biographer, who was his administrative assistant, married to his niece. So the two of them were at this conference, and somebody asked her about that letter, and she laughed and said it was awfully sweet of Uncle Dietrich to write that letter. And she said, there are things about women that he did not know. They write books about it that he's never read. So, there you had, as close to Bonhoeffer as I'll ever get in this life, his administrative assistant and his niece. And, they had the very typical Baltic, kind of ruddy, almost platinum blonde hair, gray blue eyes, and so forth. But in that book, Life Together, he's got a chapter on the day alone and another one on the day together. And he makes this wonderful paradoxical statement that he who cannot be alone cannot be in community, and he who can't be in community can't be alone. It's a way of saying, as a Christian, you need to have the full experience. You need to be able to separate yourself and disconnect and be gone from interruptions so that you can focus on your relationship with Jesus and pray and listen for the still small voice. And you need to be able to be in community where you're there for your brothers and sisters and the mission of the church and so forth. And the two of them are, the opposite sides of the same coin kind of thing. So he lifts that up. And swept. This thing keeps turning off on me.
Mm-hmm.
It says it's going to take me 8 hours and 14 minutes to finish this chapter. So, how are we doing? Anything that's jumping out at you? What are your big distractors? Tolstoy one time said having 13 children interrupted his quest for the meaning of life.
Believe that.
Well, luckily the wife doesn't follow any of this, so I can get away with this cheap shot this morning. But it was just one of those things, I guess it was about a week or so ago. It just happened. I was driving, I was trying to concentrate on something. And this little voice over the other side. And I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, I haven't responded to her in minutes, and yet she's still, and it's one of those issues, but there's a lot of things that distract me, if I let it. And a lot of times what I do is I have that thing sometimes, and she gets it. After I don't answer for a while, she kind of realizes, he's not really interested right now. But, and that's kind of rude because I don't mean it that way, but there's times, sometimes I used to just get up and walk out and just walk out of the house, go out and sit on the back deck. And even going somewhere, sometimes I go down to just watching the bird, park the car out at the pavilion, sit there, just watch the birds and the eagles every so often down there, and just myself. No radio, no nothing, just sit there, and then when
So physically disconnect.
And that's, most of the time, that's the only way for me to do that, because it doesn't matter. If I sit at home, it's a telephone, or something going up and down the road, tractors or the harvest, anything. It's just that true peace and quiet. Sometimes you got to go away. So just get out. Just move away from things and find a place like that. And there are. You don't have to drive too far. There's places right around here and things like that. Even down along the river. Just park it out and stand there on one of the piers and whatever.
You are.
garden.
I do. I do a lot. I have a lot of alone time out there, so I'm very fortunate, blessed to have that. But you know, in the next chapter, this one little sentence says everything about it. Control rather than no noise is the key. So
Okay.
you are in control of all your distractions. Pretty much, you can remove yourself from the extra.
I mean, it is possible to deliberately cultivate the skills of tuning out.
The skills of tuning out are harder than the physical tuning out. Switch the TV off, or will you be quiet? Or, you know, to your wife, that's why I pointed at you. I didn't mean that towards you. Or turn the radio
It's called
off.
Freudian
Or,
slip.
yeah, it was. Didn't mean it that way. Or move yourself into a whole different room and close the door kind of thing. Yeah, that you have control of. The actual skills to quiet your mind is a lot more work, for me anyway.
Yeah. Especially with grandchildren, right?
That's what I was gonna say too, where Teresa finished up, was, the same thing. I mean, I can turn the radio off, I can be outside, whatever, but if things are still going on in the head, that's not a quiet time at all. Need to calm that down, and that's actually what some of the previous chapters in here have been about, with, say,
Yeah.
meditation and the, what was the other one that was on?
Study.
Prayer, and study, yeah, I mean, that was all quieting the mind.
Yeah.
So this book obviously
These are
fits-
kind of
fits
connected.
together.
I don't remember, I think it was Bonhoeffer had his students at this clandestine seminary practice prayer, and they would come to him and say, well, you know, I go off down the beach, they were up on the Baltic, and it's all of a sudden my mind is filled with this person and that person and this issue and that issue. And one of the things that Bonhoeffer recommends to them in the book Life Together is, well, if something's pressing you, like you need to write your mother or something, write your mother and get it off the table so that that's not an issue. And there's a really great classic of Christian spirituality. It's about practicing the presence of God, and it's a skill that you learn, and there are different aspects of it, and part of it is doing it routinely, clearing tasks out of the way so that you're not thinking, well, I'm going to get some prayer in here so that I can get back to whatever the task of the day is. But I need to be focused in this moment. And he says, without silence, there is no solitude. And, you know, there goes the television, or I guess we should say screen time now. We must understand the connection between the inner solitude and inner silence. They are inseparable. So silence is, as I understand him, it's actual noise, whether it's spoken or whatever. Solitude seems to be more of an attitude, a disposition. So, like you said, it's easy to control the, you know, like there's a power switch on this thing. It's different to be pushing everything away so that I'm not paying attention to it and I'm focused. The attitude versus mechanics of it. He says, all masters of the interior life speak of the two in the same breath. For example, in Thomas A. Kempis' Imitation of Christ, best-selling Christian devotional for 500 years. It's another one. If you want a really great book, it's still in print. So it's really good. It has been the unchallenged masterpiece of devotional literature for 500 years. And there's a section in there called On the Love of Solitude and Silence. Bonhoeffer again makes the two inseparable in life together, as does the Thomas Merton, who was a Cistercian monk, wrote Seven Storied Mountain. Back in the 60s, he was suddenly very famous, which for a hermit's hard to do. Poor Tom. He came out of the hermitage down at Gethsemane, and he had written some books, and he was invited to come and speak. And he went to the opening session of this conference in Thailand, and then went back to his little, it was one of these hotels where the rooms were all in a, face to the outside, and you had your own little room, and he didn't come to dinner, and they went to look for him, and somehow or the other he had gotten himself electrocuted, like in the bathtub or some bizarre thing.
Wow.
And but he was a very famous guy. He was in the 60s with the kind of countercultural movement and stuff. Somehow he was catapulted to international fame, and very gifted writer. And as a hermit, he's obviously spent some time in this business of solitude. There's an old proverb to the effect that all those who open their mouths close their eyes. The purpose of silence and solitude is to be able to see and hear. So, like fasting, there's a purpose to this. If it's just to decompress, okay, that's fine in and of itself, that's a purpose. But, what we're talking about here is cultivating this relationship with God. It's a discipline. And that means it's something that when you first start to do it, you won't do it very well. And you'll have to practice over time. And the more you do it, the more you'll learn about yourself, and the better your practice will be. And now to the sacrifice of fools. The sacrifice of fools is humanly initiated talk, religious talk. And then specifically to the example that you were talking about with Peter on the Transfiguration. I think your assessment of Peter, I share that. I think he was trying to do the right thing. I don't think he knew what to do. I mean, if I put myself in Peter, James, or John's spot, it's like Jesus seemed to be able to out-hike all of them, and they're following along wherever he goes. And so he was pretty adept at fasting and prayer and very athletic, and he's setting the agenda. He's got the initiative, and these guys are following, and following's always harder than initiating. And so he drags them up to the top of this high mountain, and they're kind of sleepy. And they wake up, and they're in a cloud, which is kind of a unique experience when you're on top of a mountain and the clouds come in. And there's Jesus, totally transfigured, glowing white, and he's talking to two guys, and they recognize those two guys as Moses and Elijah. Now Elijah, he's kind of this living in the wilderness, wild-haired, crazy guy like John the Baptist. You might guess that. How do you know Moses? He looks like Charlton Heston. somehow they knew. I mean, everybody here speaks Hebrew, so if they were listening for a little while, they might have picked up on the vocabulary that somebody was using, but somehow or the other they recognize who these two guys are, and this is an in-process review. You know, Jesus is on, you know, it's like he went to the sideline to talk to the coaches, you know, at a big moment in the game, and he's chatting with them, and that's when Peter interrupts. And Jesus, Luke's phrase was, had set his face to Jerusalem. And what happens in Jerusalem? The Passover, the Passion, the cross, the resurrection, you know, that's the moment that everything about Jesus comes into sharpest focus, and it's going to the cross, and it's from the cross that he, the kingdom of heaven is accomplished. You know, what he's doing is from the cross. So he's totally focused on that. And then Peter goes, let's build 3 booths. Let's build a shrine and capture this moment. I get it. But capturing this moment doesn't get you to Jerusalem, doesn't figure on the cross, isn't thinking about the resurrection, isn't thinking about any of the really important stuff that's going on. It's a completely ignorant thing to say.
But he didn't know that.
He didn't know that. It was his best shot, and completely ignorant.
But how do you know to keep quiet if you're ignorant of it? Ignorant means you don't know.
Yeah.
But don't you get that feeling after you say something? You know, like what I just said to you, and you know I didn't mean it, but you know, after you say something to someone,
everybody in the room just
you
turns
get
and
that.
looks at you like,
Yeah, you get that feeling, and you get like all like warm and I don't know. You get that feeling, instinctual feeling, like
it's called
oh,
embarrassment.
oh,
Did
maybe
Peter feel
that
embarrassed?
wasn't. So I think that's God, like.
I mean, think of Peter for the rest of his
You have to
life.
listen.
He
Yeah,
can say, and he actually writes about it in 2 Peter, about the transfiguration. Peter was in a direct conversation with Yahweh.
Mm.
And the conversation was, my paraphrase, sit down and shut up. Because what God says to him is, God's much nicer than I am. He says to Peter, this is my son, listen to him, which is why my paraphrase isn't any good, because it was like, yeah, we're just going to disregard what you said, Peter. Do this instead. And he breaks it down for Peter. So now the business that you started with, and I wanted to get to it, 70% of the people, at least in the Western world, are extroverted. They draw energy from people, places, and things. They seek out being in community. They draw energy from it. Somebody will ask a question, and they assume that, well, let's just start talking and we'll work our way to an answer, blah, blah, blah. The other 30% are introverted, and they, by birth, genetics of some kind, don't need to talk. And they have an inclination, when somebody asks a question, they want to think through before they put anything out. And they assume that because that's the way I do it, it's like if I think about it and I put out an answer, that's my final answer on the thing. That's my best thinking. That's what I think needs to happen. Completely opposite than the extrovert. The extroverts will sit there in a meeting and somebody will say something, they start talking and working their way toward an answer, and they look over at the introvert and they go, what's wrong with him? Why are they talking? guess they don't care, guess they don't have anything to say. Meanwhile, the introvert's going, you've changed positions 16 times in 16 sentences. What's wrong with you, you know? Myers-Briggs personality type gets at that better than anything else I know of. And recommending books, Gifts Differing by Catherine Briggs Myers. She lays it out, or come see me, I'll give you the instrument. Go online, get a better answer. But that's all part of it as well. And introverts have all the same thoughts and feelings and so forth as extroverts, but they tend to live in their own head more. Now, they have a circle of people that, my brother, who's just trying to call me, is a huge introvert. And I've literally been in situations where people come to me afterwards and go, your brother's rude. And he's a huge introvert. I've also been in situations where he's with his roommates from West Point, he knows them, he trusts them, and he can be the funniest guy in the room, you know, like, and he's never done this, but you know, he's the kind of guy that would put a lampshade on his head and dance on the top of the piano until somebody that's not in his inner circle comes in, and then all of a sudden he's off in the corner watching. And people go, ooh, what's wrong with him? And it's an introverted thing. Myers-Briggs does a great job of bringing that forward for people. Peter's probably an extrovert. Extroverts are the ones that say things that get everybody to turn and look at them, and you know, it's like move on. And if you're with good people and they are willing to forgive that kind of stuff, you're good to go. And you can, you know, like in an environment like the Army, there's a lot of high-ranking introverts, and you say something stupid, your career's over, and you didn't even know you did it. Seen that too. See what else is in here. Controlling the tongue. Just a few minutes. Dark Night of the Soul. Wanted to get to that. St. John of the Cross is a mystic, which means he's someone that would spend a lot of time in meditation and prayer and silence, and be able to really focus his thoughts, tend to both think in, talk in, and receive things more in pictures than in words. And he wrote about an experience that, you know, would be more common in a monastery where you have a number of people co-located trying to really focus in their meditation and their prayer and their study. But you get to a point where it's almost total despair. And nothing's going to work for you. Mother Teresa of Calcutta was a mystic. She had these amazing revelations of God when she was in the convent before she started the Sisters of Mercy. And she was being led by these visions toward that work. And we have this interesting body of material. As a nun, she would have gone to confession on a regular basis, and there was one guy that was her confessor, and they had these long conversations about her prayer life and what she was seeing, what she was discerning that it meant, and so forth. And his assessment was that she was led through these sometimes euphoric visions to take on this work with the poor. And the day that she walked out of the convent to start the work that she's famous for, the vision stopped. Just clean cut off. And what the two of them discerned after a long time of prayer and talking and so forth, was her ministry was to take on herself the pain of these people and to experience it fully. And there was one point years into it that she was really in a deep depression and almost broken. And she had, for about 6 weeks, the visions came back, kind of like a retreat. And then they were gone again, and she went the rest of her life with none of them again. And that I found it interesting that this confessor talked about it in terms of, you know, like what Jesus does on the cross for us is take it all on himself, all of it, and bears the weight of the sin. And she was doing that same kind of thing. That's how they understood it anyway. But that, my God, why have you forsaken me, is, you know, like the depths of the dark night of the soul. And thank God it doesn't happen. Some people ever, doesn't happen often. For people that it does happen to, but you know, God's not this tame parlor cat. You know, he is wholly other than we are. There's nothing that we do that controls him, and if he feels like, you know, like putting you at arm's length, you are, and it's devastating. Part of the power of the dark night of the soul is the fear of being rejected by God. The worst damning punishment in Scripture and the testimony of anybody that I've ever heard of or read is when God goes, okay, go your own way, and he's gone. And one time somebody in our group was very concerned about, they read about Jesus saying there's only one unpardonable sin, and they were terrified that they'd done that. And the person who was leading the group said, well, let me tell you something. If you had committed the unpardonable sin, God would have withdrawn his Holy Spirit from you, and you wouldn't even know to think about it. God would just be out of your life. There'd be nothing. And I think part of the fear of the dark night of the soul is God goes quiet, like really quiet. And then you're just like alone. And it's terrifying. There's a reality in the Christian life where a new Christian or somebody that's in a particular place in their walk where the Lord's trying to move them and encourage them and so forth, it's like anything they pray for happens immediately. You know, somebody will get, you know, you got pancreatic cancer, you got about 6 weeks to get your stuff together, and this person will go, well, let me pray for you. Lord, I pray for Joe and his pancreatic cancer, boom, they're healed. And everybody at the Mayo Clinic's going, what, how, you know, was this? We have the results, and now we've got the same tests, and it's gone. You know, it's like the Lord will do that with a brand new Christian or somebody that he's moving into a direction or a new thing he wants them to do. And then the longer you're in it, he's working on faith. Trust me. Well, one of the ways you learn to trust the Lord is he gives you a little something, he's gone for a while. You know, like, you have your marching orders, none of that's changed, just keep walking, brother. And he just lets you out there all on your own. And that's a dark night of the soul kind of experience. So, the end result of it is to learn to trust God with or without the responses and the pyrotechnics and so forth, and it's kind of hard. What else? In one paragraph, it goes, when God lovingly draws us into a dark night of the soul, there's often the temptation to seek release from it and to blame everyone and everything for our inner dullness. The preacher is a bore. The hymn singing is too weak. The worship service is too dull. We may begin to look around for another church or a new experience to give us a spiritual goosebumps. This is a serious mistake. Recognize the dark night for what it is. Be grateful that God is lovingly drawing you away from every distraction so that you can see Him clearly rather than chafing and fighting. Become still and wait. Number one sin is idolatry, which is to worship anything other than Yahweh. And Yahweh is the voice in the bush to Moses. I am who I am. And anything that gets in the way needs to be got rid of. So one of the problems we were talking about, call process. Very easy to get people that are enamored of the church. It's kind of close to God. You know, it's like, where do you go to be close to God? To the church. So you're at the church, and it's not this building. It's not this people. It's definitely not the ELCA. It's not any human thing. It's not an institution. The it has got to be Yahweh, the God and Father of Jesus Christ, Yahweh, the God of Moses, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That unique individual is God and nothing else. And anything that gets competitive with that has got to be got rid of. And that's at the heart of this as well. And it's really possible for, the gifts of the Spirit can be, kind of terrorizing till you get used to them, and then they can be kind of fun. John Wimber, who was a big influence on Nicky Gumbel, read about the Holy Spirit, and he called it the stuff. And he literally started going to Christian worship services because he wanted to see the stuff, like the Holy Spirit doing things with people and watching it happen. It's like, it's idolatrous. Somebody might be a great preacher, and you might get a lot out of their sermons. Like, I love Chad Bird, I love N.T. Wright, but they're sheepdogs. I want to know the shepherd. So the dark night of the soul can put you in a place where those idolatrous things get stripped. And the point of the biblical passage in Isaiah, who among you fears the Lord and obeys the voice of his servant, who walks in darkness and has no light, yet trusts in the name of the Lord and relies upon his God. So that's when you get in the dark night of the soul, cling to Yahweh, and he doesn't change. What else? We're running out of time here. He has practical stuff at the end of the chapter. First thing that we can do is take advantage of the little solitudes that fill our day. I think the practice of a quiet time, get up a little bit before everybody else in the house. Nicky Gumbel talked about getting tea, because he's a Brit, have a place, you go to, and I'm envious of Gumbel. He's a journal keeper, so he has a prayer journal, and he writes down prayers, and then he goes back later and he ticks them off. And whatever works for you, find a place, find a time, and just be there every morning. If you do it any other time of the day, it's perfectly permissible. My personal experience is if I don't do it at 5, Teresa gets up at 6, the dog wants to walk at 7, phone starts ringing, and pretty soon it's 9 o'clock at night and I haven't gotten around to it, now I don't feel like it. So the age-old advice of do the most important things first, spend time with God first. If you're busy, remember Luther saying, I'm so busy today that I can only pray for 3 hours. So develop a quiet place, a quiet time, a quiet practice. Let's discipline ourselves so that our words are few and full. All you've done is complain. Let's become known as people who have something to say when we speak. So that's for me. Try to live the entire day without words at all. Good luck. He recommends get out your calendar and schedule a retreat.
Good advice.
So he wants us to be simple. He wants us to study. He wants us to meditate. He wants us to pray. It's like, this guy's really demanding. Next, he's going to want us to give money. So.